Good evening. Welcome to Economics 330. This is Professor Roby, City Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy, City University of New York. Welcome to Office Hour and the formal lecture part of Office Hour and Lecture Tuesdays. Today, of course, as I mentioned, is Tuesday, October 7th, 2025. And as always, the recording is on. I'm going to deliver the formal lecture, then turn off the recording, take questions accordingly, and after questions, we'll transition to office hour and handle any and all housekeeping matters that may arise. 3 classes ago, we began a 3-part study of the 3 theoretical perspectives of global trade. That sounds more like a tongue twister. Again, the 3 major perspectives include liberal, realistic, and historical materialism. And our discussion last week centered on realistic perspective. As we discussed in previous weeks, the common feature of the group of critical perspectives is that they are all critical of the traditional, mainstream, liberal, and realistic perspectives. While we will touch on several critical perspectives, we will devote more attention to historical materialism than to other critical perspectives because it encompasses the largest group of critical theories, including Marxism, dependency theory, world systems theory, and Gramscian analysis. Although all these approaches have some root in Marxism, they often diverge substantially from classical Marxist thought. Historical materialism is historical because it examines structural changes in terms of class and sometimes north-south struggle over time. And it is materialist because it examines the role of material, especially economic factors in shaping society. Very quickly, a few phrases that you need to keep in mind that are generalities when we discuss global political economy. The North-South divide generally refers to the global North and the global South. That being a shorthand for the North being shorthand for the poor countries or Western in highly industrialized countries, and the South being emerging and least developed countries. It's not an exact geographical science, but most developing and least developing countries tend to be in the global South, if you were to look at the map. And of course, most highly industrialized countries are in the global North. So again, with that in mind, North-South struggle can be a shorthand for developed and developing or industrialized or least industrialized countries. Again, another short phrase is core and periphery. Periphery is the same as southern countries, global South countries. So you're going to hear these phrases and words used interchangeably. And I wanted to be sure that you understood the context in which they were being used. With this in mind, here are the learning objectives for the week. Upon the completion of this module, you should be able to successfully respond to the following. Explain how the Marxian school of thought perceives global trade relations, to which I would say, the Marxian school of thought on global trade relations perceives produced exchange value as inseparable from the creation of surplus profits through exploitation of surplus labor. It considers global trade relations as an inherently unequal exchange. The Marxian narrative fits into the phenomena of colonial trade between developed and underdeveloped countries, as well as exchange of production between underdeveloped societies. So the broader argument here is that it argues um, that the historical materialism argues that forget the stuff about liberal order or realistic perspective, that at the core of the tension is an unequal exchange between the global north and the global south that exploits cheap labor and raw materials from the global south to feed the industrial machine in the global north. That there is an unequal client-patron relationship. We will unpack this a little bit as we go further. So more broadly, the Marxian narrative considers global trade relations as not the clash of interest and power, but rather a reflection of the global mode of protection and the ensuring relations of production among nations, right? So again, to play it back, the Marxian school of thought on global trade relations perceives production exchange values as inseparable from the creation of surplus profits. Through exploitation of surplus labor, it considers global trade relations as an inherently unequal exchange. Obviously, an unequal exchange between global north and global south, or core and periphery countries. The Marxian narrative fits into the phenomena of global trade, of colonial trade, trade between developed and underdeveloped countries, as well as exchange of production between underdeveloped societies. So this Marxian narrative considers global trade relations as not the clash of interest and power, as the liberal order or the realist perspective would have you believe, but rather a reflection of the global mode of production, which is essentially exploitation of cheap labor from the global south, exploitation of natural resources from the global south to feed the industrial machine of the global north or the core countries. So the second learning objective would be to describe and explain trade relations from the perspective of neo-Gramscian theory. Provide examples of dependency theory of global trade. The answer to that will be something along the lines of the neo-Gramscian approach does not consider the realist school of thought and the liberal theories as mutually exclusive, but rather it considers the very theoretical foundations of the two schools of thought as mutually reinforcing, with interlocking relationship between agency and structure. So let me repeat that again. The neo-Gramscian approach does not consider the realist school of thought and the liberal theories as mutually exclusive. So it's not either or, according to the neo-Gramscian approach, right? But rather, the neo-Gramscian approach considers the very theoretical foundation of the two schools of thought as mutually reinforcing, with interlocking relationship between agency and structure, right? So, the idea here is that uh, a class or a nation state, the neo-Gramscian approach would argue, cannot dominate in modern conditions by merely advancing its own narrow economic interest, and neither can it dominate purely through force and coercion, but rather it must exert intellectual and moral leadership and make alliances and compromises with a variety of forces. So, in other words, if you remember last week, we covered two of the most intractable conflict that is ongoing in the world, which of course is the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Israeli West Bank Gaza war. Neo-Gramscian approach would argue that it is likely to be successful to advance a narrow economic interest, nor can either of these countries dominate purely through force and coercion. Rather, it must exert intellectual and moral leadership and make alliances and compromises with a variety of forces. One of the things that I promised at the first day of class is that I'm going to try to make the class less theoretical by applying the theories to real life situations and ongoing current affairs. To that effect, there are two critical points here that countries must exert intellectual and moral leadership. Here is how that is playing out. When we cover the international institutions, we covered the United Nations, which, if you will remember, I hope, its core responsibility, its core role in the international order is to provide a medium for countries to cooperate and resolve differences. One of the vehicles where countries, two major vehicles by which the United Nations can mediate disputes is through the General Assembly, which all members of the United Nations belong to, and all members have one vote. But there is a higher body within the United Nations which its findings are binding, and that is the Security Council. And there are 5 permanent members, and each of the 5 permanent members can veto a resolution. Therefore, that resolution cannot move forward. Part of the reason why it appears that the United Nations is unable to adjudicate or mediate these two intractable conflicts in the world is because each of these blocs is seeking moral leadership and intellectual leadership. Moral leadership because Russia, that is a combatant in the Russian-Ukraine war, has a veto power, and the United States is strongly allied with Israel, and the United States has veto power. The Security Council has become deadlocked in being able to address these issues or being able to exert intellectual and or moral leadership on this issue. The General Assembly becomes the fallback option. The problem is that the General Assembly's resolutions are non-binding, but rather they can confer moral legitimacy or delegitimize an issue. Because of the moral leadership, I would argue, and this is without taking positions on the conflict, but merely analyzing developments in the conflict. Because consistently, a vast majority of the General Assembly countries have voted for a ceasefire in the Middle East, there appears to be a momentum of moral leadership towards a ceasefire. I suspect that's part of the impetus, among others, for recent moves by Canada, France, Australia, the United Kingdom, amongst several, I think also Spain, Ireland, among several other countries to recognize the Palestinian state as part of that pursuit of moral leadership. So, and that will be consistent with the argument in neo-Gramscian approach, which is that a class or a nation state cannot dominate in modern conditions by merely advancing its own narrow economic interest, and neither can they dominate purely through force and coercion. Rather, it must exert intellectual and moral leadership and make alliances and compromises. Make alliances. The wind is something interesting, and it's nearly blew off my my notebook. So that is interesting. Um, that is really, really interesting. But okay, we're back in business. I think my notebook better balanced now. Um, so it says that it must exert intellectual and moral leadership and make alliances and compromises with a variety of forces. And those alliances and the compromises is what you saw playing through at the just concluded 80th United Nations General Assembly session. So examples of dependency theory of trade relations include, and again, this is one that uh, core northern countries, global north, likes to cite. China's BRI. And I hope we all know that China's BRI is short for China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is a major initiative by China to build railroads, ports, and roads to connect the entire world and create a trading platform and architecture. Um, so many in the global north have accused the China's BRI as creating a death trap, a trap, and therefore dependency for global South countries. So the idea is that they're extending credit facilities that they know to build these infrastructures, recognizing that the global South might be unable to repay this credit facilities, and therefore the global South becomes beholden to China's interest because they are indebted to China, and this creates a dependency. Of course, some in the class have also, in our class, have also previously argued that the IMF is a Western institution that also creates dependency for global South countries. Again, these are charges that go both ways. Another example of dependency theory is the active extraction of resources. This active extraction of resources from less industrialized poor periphery countries for the benefit of the highly industrialized wealthy core countries. In this way, the world is polarized into two: the patron, highly industrialized, wealthy poor nations, and the dependent, less industrialized, poor periphery countries in the global South, right? Again, as I consistently mentioned in the class, it is helpful to adopt dialectical thinking as one thinks through these arguments, global political economy. A simple analysis will indeed suggest that resources, especially natural resources in the global South, is often exploited to the economic benefit of the global North. If you're from the Caribbean, think about bauxite as an example. If you're from the Caribbean as well, especially with the recent oil in Guyana, which I believe is, although in Central America, is part of CARICOM. Discovery of crude oil, with respect to crude oil in African countries and natural gas in West African countries, and increasingly rare earth minerals. That these natural resources are often exploited to the economic benefit of the industrialized global North. And this is true. But that is almost too simplistic. The reality of it also is, and this is not denying the fact that that can be sometimes an exploitative transfer of resources. But if you really think about it, crude oil has no inherent value. Until recently, rare earth minerals were not as sought after as they are now. Indeed, these commodities derive their value from research and innovation and commoditization of products created from these natural resources. The science and the technology that turns these natural resources into economic value, for the most part, is not generated in the global south. It is generated in the global north, which drives demand. Under normal circumstances, one would think that the global south may then leverage the revenue they generate, and hopefully, over time, the global south gets better at negotiating better deals and enjoy better beneficiation from the extraction of these natural resources, and are able to invest the proceeds from these sales into more productive initiatives in their countries. The inability to successfully do this, I would argue, is as much of a challenge and a problem for least developed countries. Again, this is not discounting other arguments, but is cautioning about this challenge of a single or a narrow narrative, to recognize that there is a confluence of challenges that create opportunities and challenges. So the dependency theory would further argue that periphery countries are poor because they are forcefully integrated into the international division of labor, where they principally function as suppliers of raw materials or repositories, cheap labor. Instructively, the dependency theory continues this resource diversion, right? That is typically maintained through active collaborations of local elites of poor countries and dominant states who share common interests. So the argument here is that the days of colonialism, where a foreign power comes into a country and and usurps the authority of the locals and exploit the local economy, those days are pretty much gone. That what happens now is an active what happens for the most part is an active collaboration of the local elite from the least developed countries, a collaboration between them and the industrialized north, or at least multinationals from the industrialized north. A real life scenario that is playing out today, and of which the United States and in particular President Trump's administration needs to be given credit for trying to address, making an effort to address that conflict. And to be fair, the Biden administration did as well, is this relationship between local elites and, in this case, mostly Chinese extraction companies in the Democratic Republic of Congo, who are in partnership to exploit the local resources, mostly for the economic beneficiation of Chinese processing that becomes industrial input for Western countries. As one example, rare earth minerals that are brought from the DR Congo, processed in China, turned into batteries that go into electric cars manufactured all over the global north. It is fair to say that the government of DRC is looking to consolidate and extend the government's ability to maintain a monopoly on the use of force, and therefore begin to erode the powers of irregular forces who control many of the mining regions, especially, I believe, in the northeast portion of the country. So this would be an ongoing challenge of uh, of local elites in poor countries collaborating with dominant states who share common interests. In this case, of course, the dominant states are not global north countries. They are arguably mostly Chinese. The Third learning objective is to argue why global trade relations may be exploitative of developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. I I did touch on this a little bit, and part of that is all again is to understand that natural resources have no inherent value. If you were really to pull back a little bit and think about gold, gold is not a particularly impressive alloy or metal. Gold is not solid enough. You can't really make a strong or durable knife or durable anything out of pure gold. It's relatively malleable. You have to add a different alloy to gold to make it stronger and therefore be able to hold its shape, whatever shape you form it into. Then you have to decide which, again, this has been going on for a millennia, to decide to use gold as a basis for commerce. These evolutions and innovations is what gives gold its value. But if you were to think about it in their objective strengths and weaknesses, still, arguably, is a much more resilient alloy than gold. Uh, so the same goes for rubber. When there used to be rubber barons, today petrochemicals are bringing in rubber equivalents, right? Now there are also synthetic rubber, but rubber actually hit its stride when automobiles were through the innovation of automobiles, which required tires, and eventually horse buggies before that, which also required tires, and this created demand. And research and innovation was able to employ the chemical compounds in rubber to address the challenge of rough wheels made of wood or steel. But in and of itself, rubber has no real intrinsic value except for the finished products that research and innovation is able to turn it into commercial products with commercial value. So it is a legitimate argument, I will suggest, to point out the shortcomings in the global political economy that tends to make clients out of the global south, that arguably makes clients out of the global south countries. But it's also just as true to say that perhaps industrialists and governments in the global north are not really motivated by the idea of making global south countries into clients. They're motivated by improving the economy and the welfare and well-being of their citizens. And that the uh, economic imbalance is just a consequence of that effort, to which it would also be just as fair and legitimate to say to the global south, well, you truly have to invest more in innovation. You truly have to invest more in creating domestic demand for your goods and services, or creating absolute advantage or comparative advantage in the manufacture of some of these goods and services that the world demands. A good case in point is China, that has gone from being a relatively under-industrialized communist country to now becoming the manufacturing capital of the world, and now claiming an increasingly higher degree of research and innovation and high value products and services. This is the part I would argue global South countries need to imitate and find their version of, and not simply stop at the argument of pointing out the inadequacies of the global political order. These are Many of these are legitimate and should be addressed, no question. So, congratulations upon your successful completion of week 7, module 7. And this is getting ahead of us. Of course, the successful completion would be by 11:59 p.m. Friday, but we're beginning to have just gone through the learning objectives. So recognizing then, therefore, that you should by now be able to explain how the Marxian school of thought perceives global trade. You ought to be able to describe and explain global trade relations from the perspective of neo-Gramscian theory. You ought to be able to provide examples of dependency theory of global trade relations. You ought to be able to argue why global trade relations may be exploitative of developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Again, with our studies over the past 3 weeks, and again, remember we started with the liberal order, then the realistic perspective. That was last week. Liberal order was 2 weeks ago. With our studies over the past 3 weeks, this of course being the 3rd week, by the end of this office hours, you should be able to, and this is going across the whole spectrum of liberal, realistic, and historical materialism, understanding the very concept of these 3 theories. By the end of this office hours, you should be able to identify at least 3 critical ideological perspectives of global trade and political economy. Hence, liberal, historical materialism, and realistic. Hint, hint. 2, you ought to be able to explain the philosophical differences between the critical perspectives and the liberal and realistic perspectives. We just covered the critical perspectives. Hence. And 3, you ought to be able to describe the differences between the various critical perspectives. Hint, hint. We just covered those as well. For next week, our focus will be on international monetary relations. This is where things really begin to get interesting, or even more interesting. Of course, we have touched on the framework by which the world cooperates, or what we call the liberal order or the international order. We have discussed the competing ideologies that agree or disagree with this framework. But having the framework is one thing. Being in the marketplace, as I hope you guys know about this phrase, there has to be an effective demand in the global trading system. That is, you cannot simply want a good or service. You have to have the capacity to purchase or consume that good or service, or your economy in this case has to have the capacity, which is where the international monetary relations becomes critical. And that's what we'll begin to cover from next week. With that, I am going to turn off the camera, take your questions, and we transition into office hour, handle housekeeping matters. Thank you.